Yes, Miss Pottle.
Yes, good afternoon. Sir, you have before you Sir John Aston.
Thank you.
Please, may the witness be sworn.
Yes, would you stand, please, and be sworn?
Bible in your right hand. Repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Do sit down to
Thank
give
you.
your evidence. The microphones will pick it up if you speak to them.
Thank you.
Hello. My name is Emily Pottle, and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Could you state your full name, please?
Yes, John Alexander David Aston.
You've prepared a statement for the inquiry, is that right?
Yes.
And we can pull it up now. It is inquiry reference 006053. That's page 1, I think, on the screen in front of you. Do you
Yes,
recognize that?
I do, yes.
And if we just turn to the last page of the statement. Yes. Have you had a chance to read through the statement before giving your evidence today?
I have.
And can you confirm that it's true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can.
Yes. Then, sir, with your leave, may that statement be adduced into evidence.
Yes, please. Sir John, use either bits of it that turn up on the screen or the hard copy, which I can see you've got, if you need them.
Thank you.
But it's your evidence today that I'm interested in.
Of course.
You're not bound by anything that you've said before, but it may be helpful to refresh your memory if you want to.
Thank you.
So, John, I'd like to begin, if I may, with your professional background. You are an academic statistician, is that right?
That's right, yes.
And you conduct research on applied statistics, image analysis in various medical and health fields, is that right?
Yes, it is.
Do you have an academic post at present?
Yes, I'm the Harding Professor of Statistics and Public Life and Pro Vice Chancellor for Research, both at the University of Cambridge.
You served as the Home Office Chief Scientific Advisor between September 2017 and December of 2020, is that right?
Yes.
Can you tell us, what is the role of a Chief Scientific Advisor?
So the primary role of Chief Scientific Advisor is to give independent scientific advice to ministers and senior officials within a particular government department.
I see. And is that role normally fulfilled by an external appointment?
In many cases, yes. Not exclusively, but in many cases, yes.
I see. And so in your time as Chief Scientific Advisor, you were tasked with providing independent scientific advice to the Home Office, is that right?
Yes, the Home Secretary, Home Office ministers and Home Office senior officials.
I see. And do you have any public health experience?
So I'm not a public health expert, but I've worked with health experts throughout my career.
And can you give us a flavour of the kinds of matters that you advised on? We'll turn, of course, to the response to the poisonings in Salisbury and Amesbury. But a Home Office Chief Scientific Advisor would be expected to advise upon a broad range of matters. Is that correct?
That's right, yes, exactly. So, for example, forensic science is something that is a scientific aspect within the Home Office. Drugs and drugs policy as scientific matters, and then other critical incidents, including COVID.
Yes, of course. But certainly your role wasn't limited to public health matters.
No, it was not.
Extended beyond that, is
Yes.
that right?
Nor by the sound of it to statistics.
No, not all just the statistics, no.
You set out in your statement that all government departments have a chief scientific advisor, often filled by external appointment and often by academics on secondment. Is that right?
That is right, yes.
And you were at that time an academic on secondment?
I was from the University of Cambridge.
And so, as you told us, you've since returned to academic
Yes, exactly.
posts
Exactly.
at the University of Cambridge. We've also heard about the government chief scientific advisor, who at the time of the Salisbury poisonings was Chris Whitty,
Correct.
acting government chief scientific advisor. Can you tell us what that role is and how it differs from yours?
So the government chief scientific advisor is the primary chief scientific advisor to the whole of government. You could almost think of it as the chief scientific advisor to the Prime Minister. And he is responsible for the Chief Scientific Advisors Network, which is the network of Chief Scientific Advisors across government. Most Chief Scientific Advisors do not have a direct reporting line.
Can I just pause you there, just because we're taking
Sorry.
a note, of
Sorry.
course, of what you're saying.
Sorry.
So he's responsible for the network of
Yes.
chief scientific advisors across government.
Yes, that's right.
And then you said most chief scientific advisors do not have a direct
Direct reporting line to him, but you have a sort of dotted line to the government chief scientific advisor.
And by reporting line, you mean most don't have a line manager, could be the other expression.
Yeah, so the line manager of most is within the department, but there is a sort of informal line managerial relationship to the government chief scientific advisor.
And so he's senior, that
Yes.
post is senior to
Exactly,
yours.
yes.
Okay. We'll come on in a moment to look at some SAGE minutes. But can you tell us, as the Home Office Chief Scientific Advisor, you would generally be involved in a SAGE meeting when Home Office interests or statistical input were required, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And can you just tell us briefly what the role of SAGE is?
Yeah, so SAGE, which is the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, provides scientific advice, often in response to requests from COBRA, and gives scientific advice on questions or issues that arise from that emergency.
I see. And COBRA, can you just tell us briefly what that is?
So that is the government's response mechanism to crises, and it sits within the Cabinet Office.
And there are, and we'll come on to these in a moment, there are COBRA meetings which are chaired by ministers and some which are chaired by officials.
That's right.
Is that right? Okay. Leaving COBRA aside for one moment, can you help us with how SAGE would usually work in a crisis?
Yes, I mean, as you know, SAGE became quite prominent during COVID, but that is not normally how SAGE works. So SAGE normally works by having a few meetings to answer direct questions, and then it will disband and its minutes will be published, although in this case that was not the case.
Can I take it from that it convenes on an ad hoc basis in response to an emergency?
Exactly, with a range of experts, many who are chief scientific advisors, but also external experts depending on the nature of the emergency.
I
So
see.
is its composition, as it were, equally ad hoc?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
And can you help us with this? How is the composition determined? Who sends out the invitations?
So the responsibility for convening a SAGE meeting resides with the Government Office for Science.
I see. And the head of the Government Office for Science, is that the Government Chief Scientific Advisor?
Yes, that's right.
So in this case, that would be Professor Chris Whitty.
For the Salisbury incident,
For
yes.
the Salisbury incident, yes, it changed to Patrick Balance for the Amesbury
Yes,
incident.
it did.
Is that right? Okay. And can you help us? Who sets the questions that SAGE will consider at those meetings?
So it is normally decided upon by GoScience and the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, but it will be done in consultation with those who are needing to find out the information.
Sorry, I didn't catch that last part. So first by Go Science and the government.
Yeah, but it will be done in consultation. For example, if it was in this case, a Home Office incident, they would ask what are the kind of questions that need to be addressed, and they will build up the set of questions prior to the meeting from
Yes.
that consultation.
I see.
And this one's treated as a Home Office incident in that kind of circle, is it?
So Home Office was the lead government department, and so he certainly was asking me as the Home Office Chief Scientific Advisor what kind of questions needed to be addressed.
Yeah.
And so when you say he, you're referring to the government chief scientific
Exactly,
advisor?
yes.
Yes, okay. So Professor Chris Whitty
Yes,
was asking you what kinds of questions should be considered
Exactly.
at the SAGE meeting?
yes. And I would, of course, liaise with my counterparts who were in policy, who were needing to ask, or have information for those questions. What was the advice they needed?
Yes, so your colleagues within the Home Office.
Yes.
And just before we move on, pardon me, just before we move on to the specifics of this incident, we've seen reference to quite a few different Home Office departments, and I just wonder if you could help us.
Sure.
There is the OSCT.
Yes.
Can you help us with what that is?
So that's the Office for Security and Counter-Terrorism. It was, I believe, that it was present during the time of the incident. I don't believe it is still part of the Home Office, but it
Well, let's confine
yes,
ourselves
to
to
this
how
time.
it
Yeah,
was
exactly.
at the time.
Yeah. It is it was one of the Director General areas of the Home Office.
Okay. And the OSCT was involved in the response to the poisonings, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Were there any other parts of the Home Office that you interacted with?
They may have been peripherally, but it was primarily OSCT.
Okay. Can you help us also with what the CCS is?
So that's the CCS is the Civil Contingency Secretariat, which is part of the Cabinet Office, and you would have to check, but I believe they are the ones who are responsible for running COBRA meetings.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you very much for that helpful background. Moving on now to your role in the Salisbury and Amesbury incidents. Pardon me, before I move on to that, one final matter. At a SAGE meeting where you have experts from different government departments and also perhaps different fields, if there's disagreement about the answer to a scientific question, how is that dealt with?
So the primary idea of a SAGE meeting is to come to a scientific consensus. There will be robust discussion within the meeting, but the aim of the meeting is to come to a scientific consensus. If that is not possible, then the differing opinions will be minuted, but the aim of the SAGE meeting is to come to a scientific consensus that can be minuted.
I see. And you mentioned minutes. Would it be correct to say that the consensus or the range of opinions is recorded in the minutes of the meeting, which are communicated to COBRA by the chair and used to inform ministerial decision-making?
Exactly. It is those minutes that are the primary output of the SAGE meeting.
Yes, well, we'll come to consider some of those in a moment. So now, turning to your role in the Salisbury and Amesbury incidents, you attended official COBRA meetings and SAGE meetings, is that right?
Yes, that is right.
And you conducted a review of public health decision-making following the Amesbury poisonings.
Yes.
Is that right? And that review was to provide assurance that the public health advice given at the time was correct.
Correct.
Is that right? Okay. Then let's begin with the COBRA meetings. The first official COBRA meeting, the precise dates of the meeting are sensitive, but can you tell us how you came to attend the first COBRA meeting concerning the Salisbury events?
Yes. So I was asked by OSCT, in particular, the senior science advisor within CBRN, the chemical and biological science advisor within OSCT, to come in to discuss an incident that was ongoing. it became clear that there was a need for science advice. There was a officials COBRA meeting called.
Can I just pause you
Of
there?
course.
So when they asked you to come in, was that for the COBRA meeting?
No,
or
it was to brief me on the incident that was occurring.
I see.
At that point, it was a officials COBRA meeting was called. It was clear that scientific advice would need to be at that meeting. My recollection is that the government chief scientific advisor was not available, and so I was asked to attend.
Okay. And at that briefing, presumably at that initial stage, the material known was not extensive, but can you remember what you were told roughly before you attended the first officials COBRA?
So I believe I was told the nature of the material, that it was Novichok.
I see.
Have we got a date or an approximate date? Well, the date, yes, the dates are sensitive. as
The
you
dates are
say.
sensitive.
This is at the stage when Novichok has been identified, is it?
Yeah.
Yes, it was very around that time.
All right.
I see. Were you told anything about the background of the victims, do you recall?
I may well have been, yes.
Okay. And you told us you were asked to attend because the government chief scientific advisor was not available. Is that right?
I believe so.
Okay. And would he have chaired the COBRA meeting or no?
No, he would have
chair
been
the
in attendance.
SAGE,
He
but
would,
not the COBRA.
exactly.
But he would be expected to attend.
Yes.
Would it be usual for you to attend a COBRA meeting?
It is possible, but not very usual. But I believe that I did attend subsequent ones with the government chief scientific advisor as well.
Okay. If we can pull up, we have a summary of that first official COBRA. If we could pull it up, it's reference 005814. And we can see the document is headed COBRA and NSC minutes, open composite summaries. So these are summaries of the minutes themselves. Summary 1, it says, at a meeting attended by officials and officers, including from number 10, the NSS, Home Office, FCO, MOD, DSTL, the NCA, the British Embassy, and the Metropolitan Police, and shared by a Home Office official. The following information was provided, and there's an explanation that the victim's blood samples showed all the markers of exposure to a neurotoxin, which was very potent. There was provisional identification of the nerve agent, but further tests were taking place to confirm this. And DSTL were providing the latest information direct to the CBRN consultant at the hospital, which was being fed directly into the victim's treatments. And then there's a discussion of prognosis, which at that time, the outlook was not positive. And then a number of actions were agreed. Ministers would receive a short update at the NSC meeting, with a ministerial meeting likely to follow after the results of DSTL testing. All departments were to clear both public lines and the distribution of more classified briefing through the Cabinet Office. And DSTL was to produce and send to the Cabinet Office a briefing note on the suspected neurotoxin.
Yes.
From the summary, it seems that there was no one in attendance from Public Health England, the CMO, or the Department of Health. Is that right? Do you recall that?
So I don't recall any of them being there. I couldn't swear that they weren't there, but I don't recall any of them being there.
Okay. And I think we've already established you wouldn't be involved in deciding who goes.
Absolutely not. COBRA.
Wouldn't be your decision. But it would likely be a decision from the Home Office. Is that right?
I would suspect if it was a COBRA meeting that CCS would be the...
Yes, CCS, yes. Following on from this meeting, a SAGE meeting was convened for Monday, the 12th of March. Is that right?
That was, at that point, yes.
Yes. And so at the point that it was convened for the 12th of March, which would have been 8 days after the attack. That seems like quite a while after the event took place. Can you explain whether that's sort of usual in your experience, or do you know why it took so long?
So I suspect it was, there was an involving understanding. There was quite a lot of scientific advice available already through DSTL and their embedded scientific advisors within government. However, I think the situation rapidly evolved, and therefore it was clear that waiting till that Monday was not appropriate.
I see, and the meeting was eventually brought forward to the 9th of March.
Yes.
And were you involved in that decision to bring it forward, or no?
I believe that we pressed for the decision to bring it forward. SAGE is an important part of the scientific response process.
Yes. Can you tell us what issues, before we get to the minutes, what issues did you think really needed to be considered by SAGE, and why were you pressing for it to come forward?
And there was particularly an issue around understanding contamination and understanding what had been contaminated and how to deal with contaminated objects.
Okay. And by contamination, you mean, at that stage, of course, it wasn't known that the nerve agent was on the door handle of Christy Miller Road.
It was particularly the post-exposure contamination within Salisbury.
Yes.
Both the locations and the garments and other things of other people that people were worried about.
Yes.
You
I
mean,
think-
are we talking about the places where the victims had been?
Exactly, yes, exactly.
And we've heard a lot about a secondary contamination. So were you worried about the places the victims had been, because if they had contamination on their hands or clothes, that it would transfer to another location, and that would be a risk?
Exactly, and we're trying to really understand the science behind that, because that would be important to decision making.
Yes. Okay. Well, if we can turn then to the minutes of that first SAGE meeting on the 9th of March. If we can pull it up, please. It's reference 4837. So these are the minutes of the SAGE group held at 4 o'clock on the 9th of March, held at the OSCT.
Yes.
The introduction, in fact, if we could begin just by scrolling to the end, we can set out the attendees. I think that'll be helpful at this stage. There we go. Thank you very much. We can see in attendance was Chris Whitty, the interim government chief scientific advisor. So he would have chaired the meeting. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
You were also there. You're referred to here as a cipher H57C.
Yes, that's
you.
me.
And so we might see that on other documents
Yes.
that appear, but that's always
That's me.
you.
Yes.
And we can see that the names of many of the officials are not visible, but they are from the Home Office. Can you help us with what the OSCA is?
It is the Office of the Chief Scientific Advisor. It is the Chief Scientific Advisor for National Security.
I see. There are attendees from the MOD, also the Chief Medical Officer,
Yes.
Dame Sally Davies, from whom we've heard evidence
Yes.
last week. Jonathan Van Tam from the Department of Health and Social Care, but I understand he was the deputy to Dame Sally Davies.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay. And then we have other officials from the Department of Health and Social Care, including D84U, who we will come to discuss later, although, yes, not with you, I don't think. and then Georgina Collins was there from DEFRA,
Yes.
along with officials from DSTL and Go Science.
Yes.
If we can scroll up to the top now. Thank you very much. We have a summary here at paragraph 2 of the public health issues considered.
Yes.
It was agreed that there are currently 3 public health areas of risk that need to be addressed as initial priorities for police and others. Those are firstly, where the substance has definitely been found due to direct contamination, where the substance may have been transferred by secondary contamination. And I think that's what you
Yes.
were worried about, yes. And then C, where the substance has been deliberately placed but as yet undiscovered. That final option, 2C,
Yes.
did you understand that that was a reference to a possible discarded container?
I think it was wider than that. I think it was any place that there had been deliberate placement of the material that we did not yet know about. So I think it could be that, but it could also be wider than that.
The evidence of,
At this stage,
We did not know anything about
as far as I understand it, you've no idea at all.
exactly.
So, all right, yes, and we go at some stage. You don't needn't answer it now, but bear in mind that at some stage we're going to need to find out what, if anything, you were thinking about, or when you were thinking about any possibility of discard as distinct from deliberate
Yes,
application by way of attack.
absolutely. Yes.
Right, just bear that in mind.
yes. The evidence of Dame Sally Davies was that this was a discussion envisaging the site of the poisoning, if that makes sense, not about a discarded container. And I suppose the clue might be in the phrase deliberate placement as opposed to discard.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
I think that's highly likely. Yes.
Okay. Dame Sally Davies' evidence was also that she was concerned about the possibility of a discarded container being uncovered, specifically by a child. And she recalls discussing that possibility, although she couldn't tell us at which meeting
Yes.
or when. Is that something that you recall her raising at this meeting or at
So
another?
I'm afraid I can't remember which meeting it was at, but it was either at this meeting or at the SAGE meeting on the 16th, which she attended. So it could be this meeting. I remember her raising this, but I do not remember which meeting it was at. And
It doesn't matter which one for the moment. You remember her raising what?
I remember her raising the fact that there could be additional material elsewhere, including from a discarded. Well, from the source of the material. I think we were at that point in time, we were really clear. There was no evidence of a container. There was no evidence of anything, but there was obviously Novichok in Salisbury. Got to get to Salisbury somehow. So there was she had concerns around how that had occurred. But we were very clear in the SAGE meeting that that is not a scientific question. That is a investigatory question.
So how it got there wasn't really a scientific question.
That is not a question that government science could answer. Or where it was.
But I'm sorry, I'm still not clear. Maybe in this bottle you're going to explore it a little further, but you're being asked about whether somebody had raised, in fact, not somebody, whether
Yes.
Dame Sally had raised at any stage the possibility of some, as it were, being thrown away.
So I'm not sure about whether it was thrown away, but the possibility that there was some other source from any other source. So at that point in time, so this is where it is very difficult to remember chronologically what was known at what point, because on the 9th of March we knew very little. By the 16th of March, we knew a bit more. But I believe even by that point in time, we did not know about the door handle. I think that wasn't till the... So I think...
I think that's the evidence.
But I think the fact that material had come into Salisbury, there was a question of whether there was a possibility that there could be material somewhere else.
Well, that I understand completely. That's one thing. But what I'm after is whether anybody said, hang on, supposing it's been thrown away.
Well, so I think that is one of the options that Dame Sally was raising. Yes.
Right, thank you very much.
So she's correct in her recollection that this was discussed at a meeting, and it was probably a SAGE meeting.
Yeah, so...
You can't tell us which one
I cannot tell you which one it is exactly. However, I had not met Dame Sally on many occasions prior to this, but the way she expressed her opinion and the fact that this was a public health matter, and we said it was not a scientific matter, but it was indeed, it was certainly within her purview as public health. She reinforced that was the case.
Thank you.
So she reinforced that it was within her purview.
Yes,
Is that right?
as public health. Yes,
With
although
public
we were very clear it was not a scientific matter.
Okay. And so I suppose it follows from that there was no discussion in SAGE about the public health advice which Dame Sally Davies had given.
So the only advice was that there was nothing scientific that would change the advice that she had given up to that point.
I see.
So the premise of that question was that there was no discussion about what advice ought to be given to the public. Was there or wasn't there? Or don't you know?
So I'm almost sure there would have been discussion about the advice that had been given. The question would then be, is there anything scientifically that would change that advice? And
Yes.
the answer to that would be no.
I see.
Thank you.
I'm going to take you now. Well, in fact, we can scroll down and just to finish consideration of these minutes of the SAGE meeting on the 9th of March. Sorry, if we could pull it back up. So there were discussions about the cordoning of areas and consideration about the index cases movements. And I suppose that was because there were, as you described, concerns about the secondary contamination.
Yes.
Right, okay. And if we can keep scrolling down the document, please. And so there was a recommendation from SAGE that the cordoned areas continued to be protected for the foreseeable future. There was a discussion of the sampling strategy, which objects should be prioritized for sampling.
Yes.
And then if we continue to scroll down, please, discussion about decontamination.
Yes.
And then finally, a discussion here about public health advice. And it says the current public health advice was discussed, that the risk to the public is low and all known sites have been secured. There is no need to provide further public health advice now with what we know at the moment, but this should be kept under review. And can I just ask, in relation to this, there's a discussion about that public health advice, an agreement. It looks like this is a consensus.
Yes.
Yes, that there's no need to consider anything further at
Yes.
the moment. And so I suppose with what Dame Sally had said, this worry she had, leaving aside the question of, who would be able to find or locate any discarded container, it was the consensus of the group that the advice at the moment, which was that the risk to the public was low, that was appropriate at that time.
Yes.
Okay. If we now can pull up document 004745, this is a document which records a meeting chaired by Public Health England. We've seen these before with other,
Yes.
taken the inquiry to these
Yes.
minutes before. They are SRG meetings, strategic response group meetings, and we
Yes.
can see at the top there, we have attendance from PHE officials,
Yes.
including B13A from
Yes.
whom we'll hear. And what I want to take you to at the moment is page 4.
This is the same day as the meeting we've just been looking at.
That's right. In fact,
It's
it's
before.
4 hours before, or 3.5 hours
This
previous.
this is the earlier, is it?
That's right. Yes, this is the earlier. So the reason I'm bringing you to this is prior to the SAGE meeting, Public Health England were also concerned about a discarded container. So on page 4, it says, police have identified more sites of interest with regards to primary source of origination of substance and sites for discarded unused substance. There are ongoing concerns to the ongoing risk of public health, which is why the risk assessment formation is so important. And then if we, looking underneath that at the PHE response, overall, quite a considerable concern with regards to the further identified sites of interest. What we are moving towards is to relay messages to the public around not picking up any unidentified containers and reassure that there are decontamination measures in place and zoonotic surveillance in the area it is happening. So at quite an early stage, we can see that Public Health England was considering this possibility of a discarded container and a move to advise about members of the public not to pick up anything that, any unidentified containers.
Yes.
And as we said, this meeting took place 3.5 hours
Yes.
before the SAGE. Was this discussed at the SAGE meeting at all?
So, if I'm honest, I cannot remember whether it was at this meeting or whether it was at the subsequent stage meeting
Yes.
that Dame Sally raised something, or it may not have been Dame Sally, but that this was raised and Dame Sally commented
Okay.
about that.
And what I'm particularly asking about is whether this move towards the advice to the public of not picking up unidentified containers, was that something that was discussed at the SAGE meeting?
So, I cannot remember. What I do remember was that at that point in time from the investigation, there was no evidence as to how, no evidence at all around even the location of the primary source of poison, the ground zero, let alone whether there was a container, whether the container was in Salisbury, in this country, or not in this country at all. So my understanding was that there was very little to no actual evidence. There were possibilities, but no evidence, which was what would have been considered at the SAGE meeting. So we would have considered the possibilities, but the primary thing we would have wanted to understand was what evidence there was.
I see. So if I'm asking you about what you recall from the meeting on the
Yes.
9th of March, so are you saying that you remember discussing either on the 9th of March or the later SAGE meeting the possibility of this discarded container and of messaging about the public not picking up unidentified containers, but that the consensus at SAGE was that there wasn't enough evidence to support that?
I'm not. No, I don't believe that I ever remember that we discussed the what messaging PHE was moving to. I think there was a discussion of what evidence was known about how Novichok had arrived in this country.
Okay.
And that would be, and that followed all those. Do we know there is a container? If so, do we know where it is? Et cetera, et cetera.
I see.
And all of that was clear that there was no evidence at that point.
So in the SAGE meeting, when we see this discussion about the public health advice, it wasn't a discussion about whether the advice should change to encompass not picking up any identified containers. That, as far as you recall, wasn't discussed at that meeting.
No, I think all that was discussed was that without any evidence, this was not a scientific question.
Okay. If we can then turn back to the COBRA minutes, the summary. Thank you very much. If we can look at summary 2, this appears to be the ministerial COBRA meeting. I think that's right. So the meeting was attended by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, the Secretaries of State for Defence, International Development, Business, and the Attorney General's Department, as well as Sir Mark Sedwill. And there are officials here listed from a number of ministries and departments. Were you at this meeting, do you believe?
So, given that it was chaired by the Prime Minister, I do not think I was there.
Okay. Yes, well, from
It's
the...
a fairly high-powered gathering, isn't it?
It
In
is.
political terms, at least.
Yes. There was a ministerial meeting that was chaired by the Home Secretary that I was present at, but I don't think this is the same meeting. It is hard to tell, though.
Okay, I see. Well, there doesn't appear to be any minister or officials from the Department of Health or the Chief Medical Officer's Office or Public Health England from the summary. The Prime Minister, if we just scroll down, had said at that meeting that the priority was public health. Pardon me, I think.
It's actually the Home
Yes,
Secretary.
pardon me. Yes, that's right. The Home Secretary had said that the priority was public health and supporting the work of the emergency services. But I suppose you weren't there. You can't help us
No.
with why there weren't officials invited to
No,
that
I
meeting
can't,
from
sorry.
the Department of Health. Okay. I'd like to ask you now about a lesson learned exercise which was carried out by an official to explore the use of scientific advice following the poisonings. If I can ask to pull up now inquiry reference 006186, page 2. This is the statement of the person who conducted the lessons learned exercise. Just to give us some context to the exercise itself. And we can see at it's paragraph 6. The lessons learned exercise and the report were not a formal investigation, but they were intended to counter any possible groupthink or complacency in preparing for a similar incident in the future. The criminal investigation was out of scope, but in scope was the use of scientific advice following the use of Novichok in March 2018, and how that advice fed through to the protection of individuals and the public. And my investigation and the report focused on the response phase following the March poisonings. Now, this review was carried out by an official with the cipher L55F. Were you aware that this review had been conducted?
Please, I'm so sorry to sound like a worn record, Miss Pottle. Date, please.
Well, what we're going to come on to the lessons learned exercise itself. I don't think it actually is dated, but perhaps you can help us. Were you aware of that lessons learned exercise?
Yes,
that was
I
carried
was.
out? Did you participate?
Yes,
in it?
I did.
Okay. And during the exercise, the Amesbury poisonings took place.
Yes.
That's right, isn't it? But it was commissioned before that had happened.
Yes.
Okay. If we can turn now to reference 006187, which are the recommendations made by L55F. So one of the recommendations made is concerning the timing of SAGE. So the lesson identified is, if there is a ministerial COBRA that has an obvious science element, the government chief scientific advisor should be invited, and if possible, a SAGE take place beforehand. Then it says, neither the GCSA nor the CMO were invited to the first ministerial COBRA, yet DSTL were there. It is thought that it was a result of the Home Office and NSS leading on the process rather than CCS. Can you help us with what NSS is?
National Security Secretariat, which is also part of the Cabinet Office.
Yes. And I think you already told us that the CCS is part of the Cabinet
Exactly.
Office and normally leads on
Yes.
COBRA meetings. Yeah. And it says units outside the Home Office, including Go Science and the Department for Health and Social Care, learned about the incident from the media reporting rather than internal government communication. The first SAGE took place 5 days after the incident. If it had taken place earlier, information would have been limited, but it would nonetheless have been able to set the questions or give assurance to the DSTL input. And then the lesson here, or the implementation of that lesson, is that after Amesbury, the government chief scientific advisor was called to the first COBRA. A SAGE was called immediately, and the government chief scientific advisor attended that first and subsequent COBRA.
So whoever wrote this is saying, in effect, unless I've misunderstood it, Sir John, if we get the same problem, if we get a similar problem again, before you start assembling a whole lot of ministers to discuss things which include scientific issues, get your scientific ducks in a row first.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. That the science should be on hand as quickly as possible, I think, is a good summary. Although I do believe that, although the SAGE had not taken place, and that neither the GCSA or the CMO were at that first ministerial COBRA, I do believe I was at that first ministerial COBRA.
Right.
I see.
Because I believe that's the one that was chaired by the Home Secretary.
I see. So you told us a moment ago that you weren't sure, but now you... And this isn't a criticism, but I'm just clarifying that you were... you think you were...
No, so the summary you showed was a meeting chaired by the Prime Minister. I believe the first ministerial COBRA that I attended, or the ministerial COBRA that I attended very early on in the thing, was chaired by the Home Secretary, to which I was present.
I think I've been the source of confusion there. The summary, I did say Prime Minister, but it was actually the Home Secretary.
It says in the summary it was chaired by the Prime Minister.
Okay.
I don't think you were, actually, Miss Pottle, to be fair.
Okay.
What you did inadvertently do was attribute a remark to the Prime Minister, which was a remark made by the Home Secretary, but at a meeting where both of them were there.
Yes.
But the summary document, unless I've misunderstood it, and you must correct me if I have, the summary document seems to refer to two different COBRA meetings, doesn't it? First one and then a second.
Yes, so the first one was the officials COBRA meeting.
Oh, I see.
I think we've looked at that one. And the second one was a ministerial COBRA meeting, and that's not the one you were at, because the one you were at was chaired by the Home Secretary.
Correct.
Okay, I think we're clear now. But going back to the criticisms in the report and about the science evidence being on hand to begin with, do you, in your experience, did that delay with the first SAGE meeting have any impact on the response, do you think?
I don't believe it had necessarily direct impact. I think one of the really important parts of SAGE is to provide assurance of decisions that are being made. There was lots of scientific input into the response right from the beginning, through DSTL, through OSCT Science Advisor. I think that was excellent science advice, but good science advice should always go through a reassurance process, and that is one of the primary things that SAGE can do, and that did not take place until later.
Okay. I'm going to move now to the second SAGE meeting on the 12th of March. So if we can pull up the minutes to that, which are inquiry reference 004842. Yes, so we can see here, these are the minutes from the 12th of March, chaired by the Government Chief Scientific Advisor.
Yes.
If we scroll down, you provided a situation update. So that's
Yes.
you, H57C.
Yes.
Situation update from the weekend. The Science and Technology Advice Cell and the Health and Emergency Response Cell stated that the recovery center where the index victim's car was taken had been moved several times around the yard. They're now looking at resampling the car. And you noted that those two organizations seem to be working well together.
Yes.
If we scroll down, there's discussion about the decontamination strategy, and SAGE had input into that.
Yes.
And if we continue to scroll down, there are recommendations about decontamination of vehicles. And if we continue, discussion about decontamination of buildings. If we continue to scroll down, please. And then if we just pause there, the summary of actions are for SAGE to provide comments on the draft CMO advice, but that presumably was advice about decontamination, or
I believe, if I remember correctly, I believe that is the advice to the CMO on low-level recurrent exposure to very low levels of organophosphates.
yes. And also PHE to continue to develop guidance in close conjunction with behavioral scientists to engage with the public appropriately. Was that about the same?
I presume that is the
low
same
level?
issue. That and also the exposure in general around Salisbury.
And then if we scroll down, we'll just see the attendees. So there's the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, you
Yes.
from the Home Office, officials from DSTL, from the Department of Health. Nick Gent was present, and a V13A from Public Health England, from whom we'll hear. Do you recall at that meeting whether there was any discussion about the public health advice given by the CMO or Public Health England, not about chronic low-level
No, I understand.
contamination, but about the risk to the public in general or the risks from a discarded container?
So no, I don't remember any specific. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it was not something that, particularly with this meeting, I remember being part of the discussion.
Okay. We also have a record, the SAGE meeting minutes from the 27th of March. I won't take you to those, but just for completeness, they don't refer to the possibility of a discarded container of Novichok. So it wasn't considered at that meeting.
No.
Well, I'm going to move on now to the review of the public health decision-making process,
Yes, of course.
which is a review that you led.
Yes.
Just before we dive into the documents, on the 4th of July of 2018, it was confirmed that Don Sturgess and Charlie Rowley had been poisoned with Novichok.
Yes.
And on the 5th of July, you were asked to lead a review by Tom Hurd of the OSCT
Yes.
of the public health advice, and Philip Ruttman from the Cabinet Office.
No, he's permanent secretary of the Home Office.
Pardon me, the Home Office, had asked that the review consider the public advice given at all stages.
Yes.
At that stage, on the 5th of July, it wasn't known how Don Sturgess and Charlie Rowley had come into contact with Novichok. That's right, isn't it?
Correct.
Can you help us with why that review was commissioned at that time?
Yes. So obviously the tragic poisoning had occurred earlier on. It was therefore deemed that, making the assumption that there was no reason why they had been targeted specifically, that would mean that there was Novichok present in Salisbury. OSCT were privy to some information around the criminal investigation. They felt that it was important that somebody with a scientific background looked at that criminal investigation and looked at the communication that had taken place to see whether that had any implications for the public health advice.
I see. Taking it in a bit more detail, the police had not shared information about the suspects' routes to and from Salisbury and their travel within Salisbury. They hadn't shared that information with Public Health England.
So that was the question that was part of the review, and the review said that there had been little sharing of information between PHE and CTP to PH, so counter-terror policing to Public Health England on the movements of the suspects and their locations they had stayed.
Yeah.
Just a minute. Yep.
Yes. Commander Murphy gave evidence this morning about information about the suspects' movements, their travel in Salisbury, their travel up to Salisbury, and their stay at the City Stay Hotel in London being held on a need-to-know basis.
Correct.
Yes, prior to the Amesbury attack.
And also as part of, at that time with the review, it was still on a relatively limited need-to-know basis, hence the reason this review was done by me.
So the information was still limited distribution.
Correct,
We can
yes,
put it that way.
yes.
And so you were commissioned to review whether the public health advice being given was correct, having knowledge of that
Exactly.
of that information, but also looking back to see whether the information which had been given following the Salisbury attack was correct in light of this information on the police investigation.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Well, hopefully, we've got the documents from a mini SAGE meeting, which
Yes.
will set that out in a bit more detail. If I can ask to pull up, please, inquiry reference 004838. So these are the minutes of what's called a mini SAGE, which was
Special SAGE, I believe.
special SAGE, pardon me. Why was it called a special SAGE?
Because of the nature of the information that was being given, it was a much less, the attendance was limited.
Yes, I think maybe that's, I had seen it referred to as mini because it was
Yeah, of course,
smaller.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. But because the information which was going to be discussed was for limited distribution,
Yes.
it was decided to convene a special SAGE with limited membership.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, in fact, can we just scroll down to the bottom just to look at the attendees so we can see that the government chief scientific advisor was there, who at that time had changed to Patrick Vallance.
Yes.
MK26, from whom
Yes.
we've heard evidence, was there from DSTL. You were there
Yes.
from the Home Office. Members of the Metropolitan Police, including Commander Dominic Murphy. And then also from Public Health England, we have Nick Gent and Paul Cosford. So if we scroll back up, to the top of page 1, please. Okay. The government chief scientific advisor opened the meeting noting the sensitive nature of the information discussed, which relates to an ongoing criminal investigation by CT Police. The government chief scientific advisor stated that the purpose of the special sage was to firstly discuss relevant scientific advice related to the route of the perpetrators and the overlap with index patients A and B movements, and to ensure current public health advice is appropriate. And I suppose at that stage, you didn't know, nobody knew how Don Sturgess and Charlie Riley had come to
Correct.
be poisoned. So there's a consideration of whether that the information about the route they had taken might actually lead you.
Absolutely, yes.
Might have led them to be contaminated. The second point is the effects of dilution of Novichok by water, for example, by flushing down the toilet at index patient B, that's Charlie Rowley's address, and by perpetrators in the basin in a hotel room in London.
Yes.
And that was discussed because previously it had been closed knowledge or only
Yes.
need-to-know basis that there had been a discovery of the perpetrators in the hotel room in London.
Yes.
And finally, debate retrospectively the public health advice based on knowledge of perpetrators' locations as part of the investigation. And then we can see that the chair, the government chief scientific advisor, agreed that the issue of diluting Novichok could be considered at a main sage, didn't need to be considered there at the special sage. And then moving on, Dominic Murphy noted that immediately after the Skripals had been taken ill, police had looked at the potential entry and egress routes to their property and attended to identify the most likely places where the remainder of Novichok could have been dispersed. This had led to extensive searches in a children's play area near the property, but no evidence of Novichok was found from swab testing. And then Dominic took the group through a series of maps based on CCTV analysis of the route taken by the perpetrators.
Yes.
And then finally, given the uncertainty between CCTV sightings, the size of some of the circles, and without knowledge of whether the perpetrators had taken the remainder of the Novichok with them, the government chief scientific advisor noted that the remaining Novichok could either be somewhere within a large area or indeed nowhere in the UK. So the information given by Dominic Murphy, that was information which was now being relayed to the SAGE group, certainly.
Yes.
But was it your understanding that that was information which hadn't been shared previously with public health authorities?
Yes.
And so it was being shared with you at that stage so that you could
So
do your...
previous to the Amesbury incident, yes, I think there was
Yeah.
information being shared in the few days before, but not before the Amesbury incident, no.
Okay. And then if we can just turn to paragraph 8. In fact, I'll start at paragraph 7. So the government chief scientific advisor noted that on the basis of the intelligence, the special sage needed to ask the following questions. And these are questions which come to be considered by your review.
Yes.
Is the advice provided at the current time correct, given what we know now? And at paragraph 8, we can see that it was agreed, having considered all the information presented, that the public health advice at the current time is correct, particularly given the change in emphasis taken by the chief medical officer.
Yes.
We've heard from Dominic Murphy this morning about that, and he said that he thought the change in emphasis being discussed there was the change to, if you haven't dropped something yourself, don't pick it up.
Yes.
Is that your recollection?
That would be
as
my
well?
recollection, yes.
Okay. So there's a at that moment, a consensus, a resolution in SAGE that the advice being given at the moment is correct. The following issues, though, at paragraph 7, are referred for your review. So they are, was the advice that was initially provided on public health correct, given what we knew then? Given the timing of new information as part of the investigation, did public health advice continue to remain correct? Or was there any point or points at which it should have changed? Should the advice consider different societal groups, for example, children, drug users, or the homeless? And was the process for considering the public health implications for any new investigative information and for considering any changes needed to public health advice?
Yes.
So, pardon me, it was what was the
Yes.
process? So these were the matters that you considered as part of your review, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And before we turn to the review itself, can I ask you, how did you conduct that review?
So, with support from the Government Office for Science, I or the supporting members of Government Office of Science talked to the individuals who were listed at the end of the review to ascertain what was known at the time and at what point information became available, so that we could then answer those questions as outlined.
And you asked Nick Gent for a summary of the advice that was given, is that right?
So I asked Nick Gent to give to write down what he believed was known now, and then to also his recollections of what part he had played in any of this up to that point.
Okay. And at that time, he was the senior medical advisor at Public Health England, is that right?
That is right.
Okay.
And he had been the point of contact for the investigation that was what we were told, that he was, that for any information relating to the investigation, he was the primary contact at PHE.
I see. Okay. If we can turn to his, to the summary that he provided.
Yes.
That's inquiry reference 005082. The first thing to say is, in your statement, you refer to it as a summary of the advice given, but it doesn't appear to be a summary. It's headed Assessment of Safety of the Public Health. But this is the document that he gave you at
He
an
gave
early
me
stage.
2 different documents.
Yes, there's a letter as
There's a
well.
letter which is also a summary of the advice he gave, which is little.
Okay.
But this one is the summary of where the assessment of the public safety is, as he thinks of now, given the advice he gave at this point in time.
I see. Was this the first document he gave you?
Yes, I believe so.
It was, okay. And so, just so I'm clear, it's not a summary of the advice, but it is his assessment of the public health advice.
It's from my recollection, which may be wrong. I believe we asked him to do a rapid review of the public health advice at this point now to ensure that we were getting things right now, and this is his assessment and summary of the advice he would give in terms of what he knew and the public health implications of the information he now had.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. So this is an open gist of the document. It will come on to see, but it's dated the 5th of July.
So this is before the SAGE meeting.
Yes. It sets out a number of principles to begin. It says information about the assault on and subsequent movements of the Skripal family has been well documented. In association with detailed environmental analysis, driven a robust analysis of public health risk in respect to the localities that they visited after they were attacked. The data has also been informed by a good knowledge base of the way in which the nerve agent is retained or decays in the environment, and that these principles are reasonably applied to the public health risk associated with the activities of those persons who perpetrated the assault. And then he goes on to describe the assault itself. The assault was perpetrated by 2 people who arrived in the UK. Doesn't give the date exactly, but it looks as though it's been track changed to the 2nd of
I
March.
believe
2018.
that counterterrorism policing added information into Nick's document,
I see.
and they were the track changes.
I see. And so did you receive it with the track changes?
No, I received it, and then I believe we asked counterterrorism policing if they had additional information too. But that may not be completely right, but I think that is what happened.
Okay. So this document may not all be, in fact, Nick Gent's.
I think the track changes are most likely to be from counterterrorism policing.
I see. So there is here a description of what is known about the perpetrators, that they checked into the hotel room, they traveled to Salisbury by train, and the route taken by them seems mostly to have been filled in by the
Counterterrorism
police.
policing, yes.
And then the timing of when they left Salisbury by rail to London and onto Heathrow. Thereafter, Nick Gent sets out the predicates. The material is rapidly dispersed in the open environment, and transfer from contact with a primary material can produce easily detectable contamination, but below the level capable of causing acute illness. And that contact with the material can give rise to symptoms within 12 hours. So he's describing what they knew, or what he knew at the time about the material itself. And then here, there seems to be an assessment of the public health risks due to the movement of the Skripals after the initial attack. And it says that no locations are identified with contamination that could give rise to a risk of acute illness. Thereafter, he considers the public health risks due to movements or activities of the perpetrators before and after the initial attack. And underneath, you have travel using public transport, contamination in the open environment. And I should say the risks assessed are low, negligible. And then if we continue, the risk assessed as the victim's home was high because of high levels of contamination. Is that right? And then risk assessed to the hotel room used by perpetrators was low. If we can continue scrolling, pardon me. I'll just finish with this document. We'll take a break. Underneath that, we have Nick's assessment of the public health risks due to the movement of the second group of victims. So that's movements of Don Sturgess and Charlie Rowley. Is that right?
Yes.
Around Salisbury. And then if we can just stop scrolling here. The second paragraph says, by reference to the known public health risks associated with the poisonings of the Skripals, which have been well characterized, there remains only one suspect extent risk, a presumed quantity of residual material, probably associated with excess discarded material used to attack the Skripals. And there's no foreseeable reason to believe that any additional residual materials were removed from the Salisbury area, or that multiple excess quantities were involved. Therefore, with the potential identification that the residual materials excess to those required for the initial attack are contained by the controls put in place as a result of the identification of the second group of victims, so that's Don Sturgess and Charlie Rowley, the risk to the wider UK public is probably controlled or very significantly reduced.
Yes.
So this is his assessment
Yes.
of the risks at the point in time that you ask him on the 5th of July to help you with your review. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think we'll have, again, just to get the timings completely right, I believe that on the 5th of July, when I was asked to consider what was happening before the SAGE meeting, but by Tom Hurd and by Philip Rottenham. I believe either I or counter-terrorism policing or both decided that Nick Gent needed to give us a rapid assessment of what the current public health risks were, and this is his response to that.
I see. Well, that's a helpful clarification. So I note the time. I have a few more questions for this witness, and I believe that the other, certainly the family, will have questions. So I think it would be an appropriate time to break.
Yes, by all means, certainly. 3:05, please. Sir John, you're in the middle of your evidence. Remember the rules.
All rise.
we empty the room. So could you please double check and make sure you haven't got a stray piece of electronic device or smartwatch or something like that, because it gets people very frustrated. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yes. So John, just before the break, we were discussing the assessment which had been provided by Nick Gent in the course of your review. I'm referring now to your witness statement. We don't need to pull it up, but about the conduct of the review, at paragraph 15, you say that it took longer than the anticipated 2 weeks. But by the end of July of 2018, you obtained the information that you had sought about the public health advice and what it was at various stages. Is that right?
Yes.
And you had also received, in terms of written information to inform your review, a letter from Dr. Gent.
Yes.
So this is a second document from
Yes.
him, which set out the perspective of Public Health England. And if we can turn to that, that is reference 006178. So the first document from him was an immediate assessment of the public health
Yes.
risk. And this is his written input into your review
Absolutely.
of whether the advice had been correct at the time. So he writes, I've carefully reviewed all of the advice that I've been asked for in respect to the covert investigation. I am confident that there have been no instances where my advice has been directly sought on the risk to the public associated with any event uncovered by this investigation, or to explicitly inform a risk assessment made by another person using any principles or advice that I may have given. So what he's saying here is that his advice was not sought by the police or in relation to the covert investigation, which is the movements of the Skripals around, the perpetrators around Salisbury, their travel to and from,
Yes.
and their stay at the city
Not
state.
sought by anybody, that is it?
Sorry, his.
Not sought
Look.
by anybody.
Yeah, you mean not just the police, you mean, sorry, sir.
Well, no. What about somebody within his own department, for example?
No.
Yes, I think the point, and we might be talking at cross purposes here, is that Nick Gent from Public Health England is saying that nobody from the police sought his advice on these issues.
Is he, Miss Pottle? I mean, you may be right, but why do you say that?
So he says that there have been no instances where my advice has been directly sought on the risk to the public associated with any event uncovered by this investigation, or to explicitly inform a risk assessment.
Yes.
And yes,
All right. Well, I hear what you say.
yes. And I think at the beginning of the review process, we discussed that one of the reasons for the review was that information hadn't been shared by the police with Public Health England.
So the focus of the review was on the investigation, the criminal investigation.
Yes.
Right.
So this letter is in response to that request for information about
So
the
you read
criminal
it in the
investigation.
same way as counsel
I
does?
do, yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes. It perhaps not as clear as it could be.
Yes.
But the review was commissioned in part to examine,
Yes.
because information had not been shared specifically. I mean, you say criminal investigation, but specifically what we're talking about is the route of the perpetrators in
the
Salisbury.
covert investigation.
Yes. Their travel to and from Salisbury. Okay. So what Nick Gent is saying is that his advice wasn't sought on that material. But he says that I'm confident that knowing what I do now, that in most cases risk assessments have been made which accord with principles that I have stated in forums such as SAGE, DSAG, which is the Decontamination Science Advisory Group,
Yes.
concerning issues known to those forums.
Yes.
So my understanding from that, and please let me know if you agree, is that he's saying that even though his advice wasn't sought directly, he thinks that risk assessments were made in accordance with principles that he had set out at other meetings.
Yes.
Okay. So reading between the lines, it wouldn't have made any difference.
Yes.
You think? Yes. Okay. Moving on, Dr. Gent says, at the beginning of this incident, I formulated a reasonable foreseeable worst-case scenario of, 1, contact with material likely to cause acute clinical harm would probably be restricted to people in direct contact with the primary material. Otherwise, the only foreseeable public risk would be the long-term low-dose exposure postulated by SAGE. And then finally, he says that it was foreseeable that residual materials discarded by the perpetrators could be discovered and cause acute clinical harm to those persons finding them.
Yeah.
So he's postulating here the possibility which eventuated, which is that discarded materials were discovered
Yes.
by Charlie Rowley with tragic consequences.
Although I'm not 100% sure that he wasn't still focusing on the investigation with these this worst case scenario, particularly because he goes on to talk about briefing CT policing who were looking for the material. So I do wonder whether he's particularly at this point in time talking about acute clinical harm to those people who may find residual material because they are looking for it.
I see. So you take that when he says persons finding them, he might also be talking about responders there. Or
I think particularly because we were talking about the investigation in almost all of this review, I would particularly find it to be focused on the CT policing, which is what he goes on to talk about,
Yes.
briefing CT policing to this effect.
I see, yes. Because if we scroll down the page, he says, I briefed the head of CT policing for the area to that effect and discussed general principles of public risk with her early in the investigation.
Yes.
So you take that as being...
Primarily those who were searching for the material.
I see. So risk to them, and therefore he briefed
CT policing.
CT policing
Yes.
about the risk. I see. And just for completeness, he confirms that he wasn't consulted over the London hotel room findings, but that he saw a statement from a DSTL scientist on the public health risks. And he thinks that's the only opinion relied upon by the police. And then he posits an explanation for why perhaps he wasn't consulted
Yes.
on aspects of the covert investigation. He says there's confusion between PHE Portendown and DSTL Portendown, and it may be that the police genuinely thought that they were consulting. I think he means to say PHE Portendown when asking for an assessment.
I think what he's saying there is that by them asking DSTL, it is either that DSTL would consult with PHE because they were in the same location, or that they thought they were consulting with PHE directly. But that's he believes there was potential confusion because of the co-location of the two PHE and DSTL.
Okay. We can take that down now. And then your review itself, you provide a summary of the findings beginning at paragraph 19 of your statement.
Yes. Yes. Sorry.
And you say that, in summary, our review found that there were no mistakes made in relation to the public health advice that made any material difference.
Yes.
And we did not identify there could have been we did identify there could have been clear and better communication between PHE and CTP. particularly as to the public health implications of information discovered through the investigation, and that was a lesson for the future.
Yes.
Can I ask you, did you consider whether the public health advice given in March and April following the Salisbury attacks could have been better informed by the police investigation and the searches that were being conducted, such that advice could have been given to the public not to pick up something that they hadn't dropped themselves?
So, not directly. What we considered was whether there was information that gave any additional information to what was known in the more open version of the information that was coming from CT policing that was different from that was in the covert investigation, and if there had been any difference between those pieces of information, whether that would have made a material difference. But because throughout the the covert investigation, there was no evidence there was any discarded. There was no evidence of a discarding bottle. There was no evidence of any kind of container in that investigation. That added nothing to the information that was already available in the open version.
When Commander Murphy gave evidence this morning, he described a window of some 33 minutes when the perpetrators were not visible
Yes.
on CCTV, and that they could have been in the center of Salisbury.
Yes.
And that the knapsack changed from
Yes.
one to the other. You didn't consider, did you, that if that information had been made available to public health, they might have considered with greater urgency whether there was a risk from a discarded container?
So there was I don't believe that information actually shows there is evidence of a discarded container. All it shows is that there is a period of time that is unaccounted for, and that there is a change in the rucksack. That doesn't specifically say there is or is not any container. So we were very careful only to consider the evidence that was there rather than any hypotheses that would come from that. I don't think we considered hypotheses. We only considered what evidence was available to us about any container, which there was none from that information.
There was no evidence about a container because it hadn't been found yet.
Yes, at the time, because so we've got to remember this is all. We've got to do this contemporaneously when the information was available, rather than subsequently knowing there was a container.
Yes.
So at the time that this information would have been available, there was still no evidence that there was a container.
Yes.
So therefore, there would have been still no evidence that there was a container from this information.
Yes. I think we understand each other.
Sorry.
At the time, there wasn't evidence that there was a container, but it was certainly a risk at the time, wasn't it?
So yes, I mean, it was a possibility. I think is the fair.
Yes. And we know that it's a possibility that Public Health England were in fact considering very early on.
Yes.
We've seen the minutes from the
Yes.
strategic review meeting on the 9th of March, prior to that very first stage, where they say they're considering a discarded container and considering moving towards advice to the public not to pick up a discarded container.
Yes.
So it was a risk, which they appreciated.
At that time, yes.
At that time, on the 9th of March even. Yes. And so in your report, what I'm asking is, it became apparent that the police didn't share with PHE, for example, the fact that there was a 33-minute period during which the offenders were in Salisbury, not under surveillance, CCTV. The backpack had switched from one to the other. You didn't consider that might have impacted the advice being given by PHE, that they might have in fact moved. They talked about moving to advice not to pick up something you didn't drop. You didn't think that would change it.
So again, just to get the timings completely clear, my understanding is that this information was considerably after the 9th of March, which is the last time we saw them talk about moving to that advice. So I think given the timing that this information became available, I am not sure that it materially added to the knowledge that we had at that time already.
But your review wasn't looking just at the advice on the 9th of March, it was looking at the advice.
No. I mean,
the whole way
throughout through, but I think knowing something happened, and I apologize, I don't remember the exact date that this information would have become available. We did not know that would add a huge amount to. This is why we were saying so that in our review we found that no mistakes in relation to public health made any material difference. We didn't think, but we did not know that would be something that would actually change, because we already knew by that point that there had been perpetrators in Salisbury. The fact that we did or did not know where they were was potentially was no materially different to not knowing that they were there anyway.
I see. There's just one final matter I'd like to ask you about, and that is comments discussed earlier with Miss Georgina Collins when she gave evidence. If we could just pull up the email quickly. It's inquiry reference 004793. So we already saw this email this morning. And it's, we can just stay at the top of the email. Thanks very much. So the officials are discussing whether the advice about a comment that's attributed to you at the Ministerial Recovery Group could be communicated to the public. And the comment that's attributed to you is, outside of the barriers or cordons, Salisbury is completely safe. Yeah. Did you in fact say that?
So it was very poor wording, and it was worth knowing the context in which I said that. There was a Ministerial Recovery Group meeting where there was a lot of conversation around the cordoning and the fact that people were seeing people in very large amounts of PPE at a cordon, and that they were walking next to the cordon. People couldn't understand how that could possibly be safe.
I see.
Now, that was all to do with the decontamination process. Mm-hmm. And what I was trying to make the point in the meeting, and I should have said it more carefully, was that the cordons provided an area that inside the cordons there was contamination, but outside of the cordons there was not contamination. And therefore, what I should have said was that the risk to the public from the contaminated areas outside of the cordon is very low. What happened was, of course, that then got magnified into a very short statement, which was badly worded. But I'm pleased that the system around science advice kicked in, and as you can see at the end of the email, that advice is questioned, and I was asked about that, and I very much clarified what I was meaning by what I had said, and I don't believe it was used further. Certainly my wording was not used further.
Yep, I think that is correct. Okay. Thank you very much. I don't have any further questions for you.
Right. Yes, Mr. Nichols.
Yes. Thank you, sir. So, John, my name is Jesse Nichols, and I'm asking questions on behalf of Dawn's family. Can I start by going back to the SAGE meeting on the 9th of March, but I'm not going to go through it point by point. But could we please have up on screen BGL 4837, page 1, please?
And as you're representing the family, please may I pass my deepest condolences on to the family through you.
Yes, of course. Do you recognise this document from the discussions that you had earlier with Ms. Pottle? Thank you. Can we turn to page 3, please, Bijal, if we scroll down? Thank you. You were asked questions by Ms. Pottle about whether or not there was a discussion of public health advice at the SAGE meeting on the 9th of March. Do you see that there's a heading entitled Public Health Advice, followed by 5 substantive paragraphs about the content of public health advice?
Yes.
And you've also explained, and we saw it on page 1, that SAGE at that stage recognised that one of the current 3 public health areas of risk, that was the language used, was undiscovered Novichok.
Yes.
And you've explained that that included, but was not limited to, a possible container. Thank you. If we stay on this paragraph for a moment and look at paragraph 19, please. In bold, does it read, I apologise, first sentence, current public health advice was discussed?
Yes.
Yes. So there was a discussion about the current public health advice? Yes.
Yes.
And the, I assume, consensus conclusion, because of the way you described the
absolutely,
discussions, is in bold, there is no need to provide further public health advice now with what we know at the moment, but this should be kept under review.
Yes.
Thank you. Presumably, I'm going to move on to another document, but we don't need to go back. Keeping under review means what it says. If you gain new information,
Absolutely.
you will review whether the public advice needs to change.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Can we move, please, Vijay, to 4745? These are the PHE SRG minutes of the meeting on the 9th of March that started 3.5 hours before the
Yes.
SAGE meeting we've
Absolutely.
just looked at.
Yes.
Thank you. Do you recognise the document?
Yes.
Thank you, Sir John. Can we go to page 4, please, Bijal? And just zoom in on the top third of the page, please. Thank you. Do you agree that the first passage appears to indicate that the police are identifying a risk of discarded Novichok? If you read
Yes.
the sentence, you agree?
Yeah.
Thank you. And the PHE response, under PHE response number 8, is clearly a response to that risk identified by the police, isn't it?
That would make sense, yes.
And the response is the one that Ms Pottle has asked you about moving towards public messaging, about not picking up. Do you agree?
So, yeah, I mean, that is what, I was not at this meeting. but
Just
yes,
from looking
yes.
at the face of the document.
Yeah, you know, from the face
it
of the
appears
document,
to show
yes,
that,
exactly,
doesn't
yes,
it?
yeah.
I'm going to ask you a question about if you'd received this information,
Right, yeah,
which is
no.
why I'm just asking you about what you'd have understood.
No,
if you'd
of course,
seen
yeah,
that.
that's fine, yes.
Yes. And that's what you would have understood, isn't it?
Yes.
And to be completely blunt, it's very obvious, I'm sure, the reason it appears on the face of the document that PHE are taking that view is because the police are telling them there's a risk of discarded Novichok. If someone picks that up, there's obviously an extremely high risk that they will die. Do you agree?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And so that's the risk that's being sought to be
Sought,
guarded
yeah,
against.
exactly, yes.
Right. Thank you. Now, did I understand your evidence that that information I've just gone through, none of that was shared with SAGE?
I certainly don't remember anything around PHE moving towards however it's
Moving towards relaying messages
Yes,
to the public
yeah,
about
no.
not picking up unidentified containers.
I don't believe that there was anything about PHE moving towards that. I do believe that there was a discussion around whether, you know, what was the evidential, what was their evidence for, you know, where the Novichok had come from.
So can I ask you about the police? Because obviously that's more evidential.
Just let him finish.
Of course.
So I believe that there was a discussion around the evidence of what evidence there was around where the Novichok had come from. My understanding was that there was very little to no evidence of exactly where it had come from on the 9th of March.
Did that discussion include SAGE being informed that, quote, the police have identified sites for discarded unused substance, i.e. discarded Novichok?
So I don't believe it was ever put in that way. No, I believe there was a discussion about the fact that people would naturally look for things, but that doesn't mean that there was a belief there was something, you know, that you would look for things to make sure that you found them if you were looking for them. That doesn't mean that there was any evidence that they were there.
Do you agree that if you'd been told that on the 9th of March or following at SAGE, it would at least have indicated that the police were identifying a risk that there was discarded Novichok in the community?
I think there is a difference between saying that there is discarded Novichok in the community
And a risk.
and saying that we are looking for something that may or may not be there, because that is a potential risk. I think they are different.
And so going back to my question, at the least, if you'd been told that on the 9th of March or following, would that have told you that the police were assessing, at the least, there was a risk of discarded Novichok in the community? It must follow, mustn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree in the sense that because there was Novichok in the UK, there, must by definition be Novichok in the UK, so therefore there could be other. I think we were very clear that there was no evidence as to where it was at all, whether it was close to the house, close to that, in Salisbury wider, in the UK wider.
Yes.
I don't think there was any information about that at all.
I'll come on to that in a little bit. Thank you, in relation to police searching and what that may have told you. But just staying on these chronology documents for the moment, can I bring up another document, please, Bija? I'm going to move off this one and now look at 4838. This is Sage, 10th of July. It might seem I'm taking it out of order. It's because there's a paragraph in it that relates to the March period. I'd like to ask you about it. It's page 1 of that document, please, and paragraph 3. Have you had a chance to
Yes.
read that?
Yes, thank you.
And you were at this meeting, weren't you, Sir John?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So this was the meeting at which there was the retrospective discussion, if I can paraphrase it in that way, yes?
Yes.
And as part of the retrospective discussion, we read paragraph 3 that Commander Murphy noted that immediately after the Skripals had been taken ill, police had looked at potential entry and egress routes and attempted to identify the most likely places where the remainder of Novichok could have been disposed.
Yes.
Now, do you agree what he's describing there is that in the immediate aftermath of the Skripal poisoning in March, again, the police recognised the risk of a container of Novichok in the vicinity?
So, yes, I think that is true. I think it should also be borne in mind, again, that there was no evidence. I think we've got to be very clear that this was something that they did because there was a theoretical risk. I think it is clear that there are risks of many things. It will have to be taken into account in the public health advice, the level of risk.
Yes. Of course, what also has to be taken into account when assessing the level of risk is the degree of risk. And picking up Novichok carries a very high degree of risk, doesn't it?
I think you mean the impact.
I do.
Rather than the degree of risk.
Well,
I think the degree of, I think it's useful to separate out.
I'm happy to use your word, impact. By
Thank you.
impact, the impact I mean is you could die.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
And that's the highest impact you can have in terms of risk, isn't it, to public health?
Yes.
Yes. Now, was the fact that, I'm not going to read it again, the content of paragraph 3, was that shared with Sage in the immediate aftermath of the Skripal poisoning in March?
Whether there was searching being done, I'm afraid I can't remember precisely. I suspect it was known that searches were being undertaken.
Do you agree that that content doesn't appear in any of the Sage minutes from March 2018?
I would not expect it to.
So
because the Sage minutes were clear that the investigation, or as you see in later emails, it was very clear that the investigation of where or where not Novichok could potentially be was a matter for the police. It's not a matter of science.
But of course, you've accepted that what Sage was doing from the 9th of March onwards was discussing public health advice and keeping public health advice under careful review. You can't do that without considering the information that's coming in and assessing its impact, can you?
You can. What we were carefully doing with the Sage advice is seeing whether any of the science would change the impact, or change the nature of public health advice. That doesn't mean that all public health advice was being considered by Sage. All it means is that the scientific input into that public health advice was being considered by Sage. Public health advice goes wider. There is many times public health advice is given where there is no need for a Sage input, and indeed public health advice was responsibility of PHE, but it needed scientific input from Sage.
I'm going to move on, please, to the next passage in the March period I'd like to ask you about. This was in the immediate aftermath period.
Yeah, absolutely,
I'm now looking late March to mid-April. Now, the inquiry has heard evidence from Keith Asman and also from Commander Murphy about the searches that the police were carrying out to look for discarded Novichok in the area around the Skripals property between around the 26th of March and the 15th of April.
Yes.
There is no record of Sage being informed that that was taking place in any of the minutes in March that we see. So the question is, were you on Sage aware at the time that the police were searching for discarded Novichok in that area?
So I would presume that Sage, given that it was meeting very infrequently at that point, would not be. I would have expected Public Health England to be.
I see. And does it also follow, I think it probably must, that you, and also you as a member of Sage, were not told that the searches had concluded with nothing being found, such that there remained an extant risk of discarded Novichok?
So yeah, I agree. I think we have to be very careful, though, that we don't that there was an extant risk of Novichok, depending on your level of risk that you're prepared to tolerate, anywhere that the perpetrators moved within their frame of reference. So we need to be slightly careful about the fact that Novichok was found does not necessarily imply that the risk was high that it would be found. We have to be careful that we don't flip the timing in order to change what we believe the risk was.
No, you have to consider both possibility and impact, as you've said.
Absolutely.
Can I ask you to look at another document? I'm staying in March. I'm going back slightly to the 15th, please. And this is 4704, please, Vijal. I don't know if you've seen this before, Sir John. You probably have seen it for the purposes of preparing for this inquiry.
Yeah, I have, yes.
Had you seen it before preparing for this inquiry?
I don't believe I ever
believe
saw
you
this
had.
before this, yeah.
Would you like me to take you through it, or do you recall that it contains what's described as a first stab at the reasonable worst case scenario for a secondary nerve agent incident?
Yes, no, I don't.
Do you recall that?
I remember that was there.
Thank
yes.
you. And if we look to page 3 quickly, one of the mechanisms for that is accidental discovery by a person picking it up, scenario 2.
Yes.
Can we then move, please, to page 4, Bijal, and just look? Is it possible to flip that document? I'm so sorry. Otherwise, we can
Tip our head.
flip and crane our necks. Yes, as Sir John is already doing. Thank you very much. Do you see that it describes, under the heading consequence management, it refers to the following consequence management issues are identified for the health sector for both scenarios. That appears to be, first scenario, deliberate further attack. Second scenario, 2 versions of accidental discovery, human and animal. And then there's issues, questions, issues, and actions. Yes?
Yes.
Can we look at page 6? I promise this will be the last one from this document, Bijal. It might require another flip, I'm afraid. While this is being flipped, Sir John, you know from looking at this now that this was prepared within central government by an official at the preparedness department within Department for Health, don't you?
Yes.
Thank you. Do you see in the first row there is a column that says communications?
Yes.
And then there's a first bullet point that says what information should be given to the public.
Yes.
What is the action in relation to that?
Assuming that was the second column, sorry, I can't remember what
It was.
I don't believe there is one, sorry. So
There's no action.
Is that what you're
to
asking?
do about that? Yes.
I would not, this is not my document. I do not know anything about how this has been prepared.
Can we look, please, at the email document that shows who this document was circulated to, or at least the discussions about its creation? And this is 6191, please, Bijal. It should be on the first page. We look at the first third of the page, please, and you can see senders and recipients. Just at the top, thank you. Well, obviously, a lot of them are blocked out to remove email addresses, but do you see it's sent from someone at the Department for Health?
Yes.
And it goes to, among others, multiple officials at the Cabinet Office. Jenny Harries, she was senior PHE, wasn't she? Yes?
Yes.
Nick Gent, he's
Yes.
described. Jonathan Van Tam, who was technically DHSC,
Yes.
but was actually the deputy for the Chief Medical
Yes.
Advisor, Dame Sally Davis. V13A, who is a senior official at Public Health England, who we'll hear from. Someone else from the NHS. Dean Hayden, who was in charge of the CTP investigation. Yeah. And then others from the Government Office for Science.
Yes.
Does that include at least some officials that you had dealings with yourself during this period?
Yes.
And is it right from what you said earlier that you were at no stage made aware that this exercise was taking place, either by being emailed or by being told by one of the people who received it, this is happening?
I have never. I have no recollection of ever seeing this document. No.
Thank you. I'm assuming, therefore, you can't help with whether anything was done after the 15th of March when it was circulated in the form I showed you in the table about taking it forward.
Not that I know of. No.
Thank you.
Have you already covered it?
Almost certainly not, sir. I do apologise.
No, I very much expect you have. The question that is asked, apparently within the department,
Yes.
is would you like us to take on second action below, which is?
Well, if it helps, sir, to short-circuit it, I can explain. But essentially, we were disclosed 4 documents which show an email thread in which there were action points from a meeting. Action point 2 was PHE to create a reasonable worst-case scenario for a secondary nerve agent incident. PHE also allocated multiple other action points, and as a result, someone from Department of Health writes to Ms. Harries at PHE to say, we know you, i.e. PHE, are very busy. Would you like us to take this on? They send that on the 8th of March.
So it's the formulation of the reasonable worst-case scenario.
It shows you how
And
the
it
document...
and it fits in with the dates, doesn't it? Because this is the 8th of March, and the RWCS document is,
15th.
I think, the 9th. Is that right?
The RW document is the 15th.
15th.
Yes.
Yeah, all right, that's clear now.
Thank you
Sorry
very
to be
much.
slow.
Not at all. Now, seeking to tie some of the threads together over the last 10 minutes that we've been going through, by late March, do you agree that, among other matters, you've accepted it was a possibility there was a discarded container? Obviously, you can't put it higher than that.
Yes.
Sage had contemplated that there was undiscovered Novichok out there.
I think.
We've seen that, haven't we?
Yeah, I think Sage had said that it wasn't a scientific consideration of that was an investigatory consideration.
Sage had indicated there was no need to change the public health advice, but the matter would be kept under review.
Yes.
The police had identified a risk of discarded Novichok to Public Health England.
I believe so. Yes.
Yes, it was in the 9th
Yeah,
of
in
March
the
minutes
March
I took you
minutes,
through. Central government, including Department of Health, Cabinet Office, and Go Science, as well as others, was identifying the concern around a secondary incident caused by discarded Novichok. Do you agree?
If you're, that document you've just shown me,
Yes.
that's a reasonable worst case scenario. So I think you have to remember that that is a reasonable worst case scenario. It is not a central planning assumption.
Yes, that was the reasonable worst case scenario they were identifying on the 15th
Yeah, no,
of
I'm
March.
happy that. Yeah, yes.
Your evidence was that either on the, you thought, the 9th or the, I think you said
I think
16th,
the 16th, yes.
Dame Sally had herself raised the concern within Sage that someone would pick up a container or in some other way cause themselves to be infected and die.
I think that was her. Yes, I believe that is what she said. She didn't give a risk associated to it, but she said that was something, and that she was very clear that even though that wasn't a scientific consideration, because that was an investigatory consideration, it was something that she and PHE should consider for public health advice.
And final point on the compendium, CTP were actively searching for a discarded container of Novichok at that time, late March to early April.
I think the way you phrase it that way, you've got to be quite careful. CTP were actively searching for a possible container. I don't think they were searching for a container because they did not know a container existed. That they were performing searches because there was a possibility that there might be a container, but there was no evidence that there was a container.
Yes. What there was a suspicion that, based on having identified ground zero, a container had been used to administer the Novichok to the door handle. And so they were looking for a possible container that had done that.
Not even sure that you can go so far as saying a container in that. I mean, it depends I don't know what we're, so I think we just need to be really careful about saying what.
Yes. How, just stepping back, so John, I am seeking to be careful, and I apologise if it doesn't come across in that way. How, other than a container, were you envisaging that a deadly nerve agent that can kill with less than a grain of sand on the skin was transported to allow administration to a door handle? What other mechanism were you thinking they might need to be searching for?
So I think you could imagine all sorts of things. I think I will have to stop at this point, I'm afraid.
Yes. Taking those points I went through together, do you agree that based on what was known in March, there was an imperative to tell the public what was told later? That is, do not pick up unidentified containers that you didn't drop because of the risk?
So I think it's a really good question.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. I think in public health advice, there is always a balance. There are risks of saying things, there are risks of not saying things. It has to be balanced against what is known and what are possibilities. There is a risk of causing panic if you say more than is known and you don't say it in a careful way. Given, again, I go back to the fact that because something was found, we have to be very careful not to mean that implies that the probability of it being found was high. I still don't quite know how we would have separated, for example, Salisbury from anywhere else that the perpetrators travelled from.
The risk of not issuing such advice is what happened to Dawn Sturgess. Do you agree? Death because of the container being picked up.
I think that is a very big jump.
Well, that is the risk. If there is a container,
I think
telling
not
people.
that is not a causal. I think you're trying to say that's a causal.
Suggesting it's a risk. It's
So-
one of the possibilities that may occur.
Mr. Nichols, you're really just arguing with him now.
I hope very politely, sir.
That's
I think you're very
afraid not a
politely doing
sufficient excuse.
No, indeed. Do you consider that was the risk of not issuing such advice?
I believe that was a risk, regardless of whether such advice was issued or not.
Would issuing advice that was in fact subsequently issued in July, do not pick up unidentified containers, was there a risk that that would somehow cause mass panic?
There was a risk that it could cause panic, yes. I'm not sure what the definition of mass panic is, but yes.
It would result, wouldn't it, at most in a large number of people potentially not picking up items from the street?
I think if you looked at the concerns that people had around the cordons, for example, that showed that concern would go wider than just thinking, oh, it's fine, I just don't need to pick things up, which I think is...
Did panic eventuate on the 10th of July when the CMO issued advice to the public not to pick up unknown containers?
I think that if I was living in Salisbury at that point in time, I would have been very concerned.
That's not what I asked. I asked, did panic eventuate when that advice was issued?
Also, I think at that point in time, there was clear evidence that that there was some form of residual container of Novichok, and therefore it was the right evidence, the right information to give. I cannot say whether I don't believe mass panic, in your words, occurred, but I do not know what the residents of Salisbury felt at that point in time.
Now, final topic, and briefly, you were asked by Mr. Rutnam, as I understand
Yes.
it, who was the permanent secretary,
Yes.
is that right, to review public health advice.
Yes.
And as I understand it from your statement, it's paragraph 13A, you were being asked to consider, among other things, whether, quote, the initial advice on public health had been correct.
I think it's all of this is in the context of the covert investigation.
Yes.
This whole review is in the context. So anything that is listed in there it should be taken within the context of the covert investigation.
I wasn't actually focusing on the covert point. I understood that, and I wasn't going to go back to it. It's just to clarify that your evidence, which has been adduced in your statement, was that you were being asked to advise on whether the initial advice on public health was correct. That's the word you used in your own statement.
Yeah, in the context of the... I wasn't making...
Given what was known then, is what it then says in your statement. It's page 3 of your statement, paragraph 13A.
So,
I was to lead a review to cover the following issues. Was the advice that was initially provided on public health correct, given what was known then?
sorry, I'm just going to try and find it. I think I've got
Page 3 of INQ 6053.
Yeah, I may have a slightly different version. Apologies. I was asked to... Sorry, paragraph which? Sorry.
13A.
13A.
Obviously, I'm focusing on this given the nature of the questions.
Yeah.
I've been asking.
Now. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank
I'm
you.
very sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
So I was need to cover it. Was the advice was initially provided on public health correct, given what was known then?
Now, you explained much earlier in your evidence in relation to your qualifications
Yes.
that you have a highly eminent background in statistics.
Yes.
I mean this with absolutely no
I know you do.
disrespect.
I know you do.
But the family, I hope you understand
No, absolutely.
why,
I
would wish to
completely-
understand how it was that you were qualified to assess the correctness of public health advice, given that you said to the chair you had no public health qualifications, and although
absolutely.
you had had contact with public health professionals, were not one yourself.
Correct.
Do you understand the
Yes.
question?
Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you. And what is the answer to that question?
So, the range of people who were able to perform this role at that time was very limited. I had the best advice, best expertise available to be able to lead this review. It was important that this review was done because it was important to understand whether the public health advice at that particular point in time was correct going forward. That was essential. And it was also important to understand what could be learnt from what had happened in the past, and therefore it was most important to have that information done. As Home Office Chief Scientific Advisor, I had a large range of expertise around how systems of government worked, and it was deemed that I was the most suitable person available at that point in time to do this.
Just give me one moment, Sir John. Thank you for your time and for enduring my rudeness. Thank you very
Right,
much.
thank you.
Yes.
So, John, I ask questions on behalf of counter-terrorism policing.
Of course.
My name's Jason Beer.
Yes.
I'm not going to argue with you, even politely, but instead ask for your help on a couple of topics, if I may. They're topics that have been covered already, but I want to come at them from a different angle, if I may. Can we display on the screen, please, at the same time, 4745 and 4847? The document on the right-hand side is probably the wrong one, 4837.
You mean 4837, do you, Mr. Mayor? Yep.
Yes.
The 2 9th of March documents, is that what we're after?
It is. Thank you very much. We've looked at both of these, Sir John, in different contexts, but as the Chair has just pointed out, these are the 2 9th of March documents. Can you see
Yes,
that?
I can, yes.
Public health document on the left-hand side, SAGE document on the right-hand side, separated by 3.5 hours, as has been mentioned
Yes.
twice already, 12:30 versus 4:30. And on the left-hand side, we can see that you're not an attendee.
Correct.
It's all Public Health England bar one. There's one NHS England attendee, the national head of EPRR.
Yes.
Yes? And then on the right-hand side, I think we looked at page 3 of the document already on the right-hand side and saw that you were an attendee at this SAGE
Yes.
meeting, as you were all 3 SAGE meetings in March.
Yes.
On the left-hand side, if we can go to page 4, please. Thank you. The familiar boxes that we've looked at more than once already. Top box, police have identified more sites, ... and sites for discarded unused substance. And then under PHE response in box 8, what we're moving towards is to relay messages to the public around not picking up any unidentified containers. Yes?
Yes.
And essentially you've told us that that moving towards was not discussed at or didn't reach you at the 4 o'clock meeting in SAGE.
That is, I believe, yes.
Thank you. Now, I think you'll agree that there's no overlap in attendees between
Right.
those on the 12:30 versus those at the 4 o'clock.
Correct.
No overlap at all.
Correct.
If, however, we go back, please, on the left-hand side to look at page 3, and just look at the bottom, please, of page 3. The box right at the bottom where cross-governmental risk assessment, if that can be blown up. Thank you. Can you see that it records that there's a cross-governmental risk assessment meeting happening now, sharing high-level secure information, NG, which I think is
Nick Gent, yeah.
in attendance. And then this, a DHSC, that's Department of Health and Social Care, yes?
Yes.
NHS England, Public Health England, and Chief Medical Officer meeting at 2 p.m.
Yes.
with JH, presumably Dr. Jenny Harris, attending.
Yes, presumably.
If we, so remembering DHSC, PHE, and CMO from that list,
Yes.
attending the 2 o'clock. If we go to page 3 on the right-hand side, please. We can, I think, see amongst the attendees of the meeting on the right-hand side, no PHE, but we can see attendees from the Department of Health and Social Care, including Mr. Van Tam, D84U, somebody who's been blanked, yes?
Yes.
So does it amount to this? In short, there was some organisational continuity between the 12:30 p.m. meeting and the 4 p.m. meeting because of an overlap of attendees at the 2 p.m. meeting.
I presume so. And I would also presume that the Chief Medical Officer would be briefed before she came to SAGE.
That's a second good point because he is one of the people attending the 2 o'clock CMO meeting, and Dame Sally Davis herself was an attendee at the 4 o'clock.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, we've looked already at the passage in the left-hand document concerning the moving towards putting out public health advice about not picking items up. There appears to be no consideration of that in the SAGE meeting. Agreed?
So there's no minutes, but as I said before, the minutes would be the consensus science advice, and that was not that the exploring finding it would not be a scientific issue.
And as Mr. Nichols has already established, a whole part of the minutes is given over to public health advice on the right-hand side.
Yes.
Yes? Would you have expected PHE's position, as seen on the left-hand side, to have been represented at this meeting?
In general, yes, probably through the CMO, but that's a conjecture.
Thank you. Can we turn to the second subtopic then? Consider attendance at SAGE meeting generally. You, as we've established, attended all 3 SAGE meetings.
Yes.
Can we look, please, at the second SAGE meeting, 4842? Both documents can come down. This is the second of 3 SAGE meetings, the 12th of March. And if we go to page 5, please, that's the list of attendees. And although we whizzed through this earlier, can we see that you're there, H57C, and then 4 or 5 down, D84U from the department? Can you see that?
Department of Health, yes.
Yes, along with Dr. Gent and V13A from PHE on the right-hand side, yes?
Yes.
And then look at the third meeting, please, 4841, please. And last page, which is page 3, please. Attendance list, if that can be blown up, please. We can see you're there second in.
Yes.
And then 5 or 6 on. We can see D84U is there again, yes?
Yes.
And also Nick Gent and V13A, yes? So I think what we've just established, Sir John, is that you and D84U from the Department of Health and Social Care were attendees at all 3 SAGE meetings.
That's probably correct. Yes, sorry, I can't remember exactly the first one. Sorry, there's been a few names between now. But if it was on the first one and here, yes.
It is, all 3, both of you there, please. Can we look, please, at 4836? This is an email chain between people whose jobs and names are not revealed to us. But I think if we just look at the email at the foot of the page, please, we can see that it's dated the 20th of June.
Yes.
Its subject is the D84U meeting, yes?
Yes.
And it says, please see the write-up of the interview with D84U enclosed, yes?
Yes.
So this is the person that attended all 3 SAGE meetings with you, yes? D84U. And if we go over the page, and also can we see that it must have been undertaken by the 20th of June, this interview?
Yes.
If we go over the page, please, to page 2, if we see the heading at the top, interview with D84U of the Department of Health, yes?
Yes.
And then if we go to the third page, please, under the heading Public Health Response, and D84U said in their interview, the possibility was considered that other caches of the agent could be present, e.g. in a discarded bottle. It was agreed to be ready for a surge medical response if more people became ill, but not to stoke panic by issuing public messages about this hypothetical scenario. An assumption was made that the assassin was acting professionally. So we've seen that you and D84U were present in these 3 SAGE meetings together. Firstly, was the possibility considered that other caches of the agent could be present in a discarded bottle in your presence and hearing at any of those 3 SAGE meetings?
So again, I think not sure discarded bottle. I think you'll be careful about the. I don't think it was clear as to what, but I think there was a discussion as to whether there could be potentially other sources of Novichok. That was discussed, but again, it was said to not be a scientific question, which is what SAGE is there to consider.
And is that why it doesn't make it into the minutes?
Absolutely.
Was it agreed in any of the SAGE meetings, reading D84U's answers or responses on here, that the response that was to be prepared was a surge medical response if more people became ill, but not to stoke panic by issuing public messages about that hypothetical scenario?
Again, that wouldn't be a SAGE decision. That would be, that's not a scientific question.
I can read it for myself, Mr. Bear, but it's not for him, is it?
No, I'm just finding out whether the context of 84U saying this was that this was a discussion that happened in a SAGE meeting.
Oh, I see. Apparently
Yes.
No.
And your answer is no, it was not.
So, I mean, there may have been, I don't remember there being a surge medical response being discussed within a SAGE meeting.
I'm more interested in whether it was discussed within SAGE that the message of not picking up should not be delivered because it might stoke public panic.
So that may have been discussed, but I think it was clearly said that was not a scientific question.
And lastly, on what D84U says, was the discussion in the SAGE meetings, the three of them that the pair of you attended, that that message oughtn't to be delivered because an assumption was made that the assassin was acting professionally?
The first time I ever saw that was in this document.
Yeah. So that wasn't a discussion that occurred in the course of a SAGE meeting?
No.
You've said a number of times that things weren't scientific. Can you agree with these propositions then? Whether there was or was not discarded Novichok was not regarded as a scientific question.
Correct.
Secondly, if there was discarded Novichok, how it got there was not regarded as a scientific question.
Correct.
Thirdly, you worked on the basis that discarded Novichok was a possibility, that was a public health question.
Correct.
And then thirdly, fourthly, in the light of what you came to discover after the second incident in relation to the suspect's movements, did not in the event or would not in the event have changed the public health advice that was given between the incidents?
There was no evidence that would have changed, that was any different to the evidence that was available to the open public health questioning, so therefore would not have changed the public health messaging.
So John, thank you very much.
So, good
Yes,
afternoon.
by all
I'm
means.
Junior Counsel to HM Government.
Yes.
So, John, good afternoon. I just want to ask you questions about one element of your evidence, please. You considered in your review the public health advice,
Yes.
including the if you didn't drop it, don't pick it up advice. You were asked questions by Mr. Nichols about some of the downsides to giving that advice, particularly the risk of panic. Were there any other downsides to issuing that advice in your opinion?
So with all public health advice, you have to be very careful to consider all the different things. There was quite a lot of public health messaging that was required, that was based on evidence. In particular, there was public health messaging that needed to be considered for those who had been in places which there was known to be contamination, and there was public health messaging that needed to be considered for those who, for example, had clothes that were being washed, needed to be washed. I think it was important that there wasn't mixed messaging, and it was very important that the public health messaging, as far as possible, was based on evidence.
Thank you. You said that there was could be concern that went wider than about not picking things up. Are you able just to elaborate on where that concern?
I mean, I think I meant, I think we have to be very careful about the fact that to be consistent, because there was no knowledge as to where any of this happened, we would have needed to consider public health messaging. If public health messaging was going to be given about not picking something up, that would need to be considered on a basis of how far within the UK that would be given, and again, you know, people, as we saw with the cordoning, become. It is distressing to find that you do not understand the environment that you are in the same way as you consider that you can normally consider it to be.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Is there anything else, Ms. Bottle?
There's no more evidence to be called today.
All right. So, John, thank you very much for your help. There's no need to stay, though, of course, you're free to listen if you feel the need. Now then, tomorrow, 10 o'clock, level,
Level 2.
I think it's probably 2, isn't it?
Yes, I'm being told. Level 2.
Level 2 tomorrow, then, please, everybody, no devices. 10 o'clock, please.